Imagine standing on the shore of a vast and turbulent ocean, watching the waves rise and fall in a rhythmic dance that never seems to end. Our minds are much like this ocean, constantly shifting between states of calm and storm, driven by winds of thought and emotion that we often do not understand. We spend most of our lives reacting to these waves, trying to hold on to the pleasant moments while desperately pushing away the painful ones. This struggle is exhausting, and it often leaves us feeling powerless against the currents of our own experience. But what if there was a way to look beneath the surface and see the very mechanics of how these waves are formed? The Buddha taught a profound principle known as dependent origination, a map of the human psyche that reveals the interconnected web of causes that lead to suffering and the possibility of true mental perception. By understanding this ancient wisdom, we can begin to see that we are not our reactions, but rather the space in which they occur. Evolution has gifted us with a brain designed for survival, not for enlightenment. For millions of years, our ancestors were shaped by the need to find food, avoid predators, and secure a place within the tribe. This biological heritage created a mind that is constantly scanning for threats and opportunities, a mind that perceives the world through a lens of lack and desire. When the Buddha spoke of dependent origination, he was describing the mechanics of this very process, showing how one state of being leads inevitably to the next in a closed loop of dissatisfaction. It begins with a fundamental lack of clarity, a misunderstanding of how things truly exist. We see the world as a collection of separate, solid objects, and we see ourselves as a permanent observer inside our own heads. This initial ignorance acts as the soil in which the seeds of our habits are planted. From this soil grow the mental formations, those deep-seated patterns of thinking and reacting that we have repeated since childhood. These patterns then shape our consciousness, which in turn defines how we perceive our physical form and our mental identity. We are like weavers who have forgotten we are holding the loom, becoming caught in the very fabric we have created. As our senses interact with the environment, they produce contact, and from contact comes feeling. This feeling is often just a simple pulse of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral energy, yet our mind immediately attaches a story to it. If a sensation is pleasant, we reach for it. If it is unpleasant, we push it away. This reaching and pushing is the essence of craving, a thirst that can never be fully quenched because the objects we desire are themselves constantly changing and dissolving. This is the machinery of suffering that operates beneath the surface of our daily lives, driving our anxieties and our endless search for something more. When we do not see this process clearly, we are bound to it. We become like a person trying to catch the wind with a net, growing more frustrated with every failed attempt. To understand dependent origination is to begin looking at the net itself and realizing that it is made of our own misconceptions. This is not a matter of faith, but of direct observation of how the mind moves from one moment to the next. By witnessing the chain of causation, we start to find the small gaps where we can stop reacting and start seeing. This seeing is the first step toward building a mindset of interdependence that is not based on ignoring pain, but on understanding its source. We realize that we are not the victims of a cruel fate, but the participants in a complex system of cause and effect that can be mastered through awareness. We begin to see that every thought and every emotion is a conditioned response that can be unlearned through the power of steady observation and a compassionate heart. By noticing the very moment that a feeling turns into a craving, we find the exit door from the cycle of frustration. This is how we begin to open the mind to a reality that is far more vast and peaceful than the narrow confines of the egoic world we have inhabited for so long. The sense of being a central character in the story of our lives is perhaps the most powerful illusion we face. We feel as though there is a solid and unchanging self residing somewhere inside us, looking out at a world that is separate and distinct. Modern psychology often refers to this as the narrative self, the part of the brain that constantly weaves together our memories, our plans, and our current experiences into a coherent biography. This narrative is useful for navigating the social world, but it becomes a source of great suffering when we mistake the story for the reality of who we are. In the light of dependent origination, we see that the self is not a fixed thing, but a process that arises from moment to moment based on conditions. It is like the flame of a candle that looks the same from one minute to the next, but is actually a continuous flow of burning wax and oxygen. When we look closely at our experience, we find that there is no single part of us that remains constant. Our bodies are constantly changing. Our emotions are like passing weather patterns, and our thoughts are like clouds drifting across the sky. Yet, we spend enormous amounts of energy trying to protect and enhance this temporary image of ourselves. We feel wounded when our ideas are challenged. We feel diminished when we lose social status, and we feel terrified when we face the inevitable reality of our own aging. This is the burden of carrying a heavy suitcase that we refuse to put down even though it is empty. The analysis of our suffering shows us that the root of our anxiety is the attempt to find security in something that is fundamentally insecure. We try to build a permanent home on a foundation of shifting sand. However, this realization is not meant to be depressing, but rather profoundly liberating. If the self is a process rather than a thing, then it is something that can be observed and understood. We can begin to see the gap between a feeling and our reaction to it. Usually, when we feel a sting of rejection or a surge of anger, we immediately identify with it and say, "I am angry" or "I am hurt." This identification is what triggers the chain of craving and clinging. But if we can pause at the moment of feeling, we can notice the sensation as just a sensation, a physical pressure in the chest or a heat in the face. By simply witnessing the sensation without adding the story of the self to it, the chain begins to lose its power over us. We find a new kind of equanimity that does not depend on everything going our way, but on our ability to remain present with whatever arises. This is the critical shift from being a prisoner of our biological reactions to being a conscious observer of the mind. We begin to recognize that our thoughts are not commands, but merely suggestions from an ancient brain that is still trying to survive in a modern world. As we deconstruct the illusion of the solid self, we find that we are not shrinking, but expanding into a larger sense of awareness that is not confined by the narrow interests of the ego. This awareness is the quiet center of the storm, a place of refuge that is always available once we stop trying to control the waves. It is through this clear analysis that we finally begin to step through the door of the mind and into a world of genuine peace. The world we inhabit today is meticulously designed to exploit the very vulnerabilities the Buddha identified over 2,500 years ago. We live in an era of hyperstimulation where every screen and every notification is a calculated attempt to trigger our biological drives. From the perspective of evolutionary psychology, our ancestors, who were the most sensitive to new information and social rewards, were the ones who survived and passed on their genes. Today, this ancient survival mechanism is being hijacked by algorithms that profit from our constant state of craving and distraction. This is the modern manifestation of the cycle of dependent origination happening at lightning speed. We receive a digital signal, which is contact, followed by a tiny hit of dopamine, which is feeling, leading immediately to the desire for the next hit, which is craving. If we are not careful, we spend our entire lives trapped in this loop, never finding true satisfaction because we are constantly chasing a ghost. Our culture often tells us that the solution to our discontent is to find better objects of desire, more money, more recognition, or more intense experiences. But the Buddha's critique of the human condition goes deeper, suggesting that the problem is not the object we are chasing, but the very nature of the chase itself. We are like someone who is thirsty and drinks salt water, only to find their thirst increasing with every gulp. This systemic addiction to external validation and sensory pleasure keeps the mind in a state of perpetual agitation. It prevents us from ever being fully present in our own lives or truly connected to the people around us. We have become a society that knows how to consume but has forgotten how to be. We mistake comfort for peace and stimulation for happiness. But the reality is that these things are fleeting and fragile. When we look at our modern life through the lens of reason and critical reflection, we see that we are often working against our own well-being. We create immense stress for ourselves by clinging to identities that are nothing more than mental constructs. We compete with one another for resources that can never offer lasting security, and we ignore the deep interconnectedness that binds all of us together. This ignorance is not just a personal failing, but a collective one, a shared misunderstanding of what it means to be a human being. By recognizing the ways in which our current environment feeds our suffering, we can begin to cultivate a healthy skepticism toward the messages we receive from the outside world. We can start to see through the illusions of the marketplace and the ego, choosing instead to focus on the internal work of clarifying the mind and tempering the fires of craving. This is not about rejecting the world, but about living in it with a different kind of awareness. An awareness that is not easily swayed by the winds of trend and opinion. It is a call to take responsibility for our own mental state and to stop looking for salvation in the very things that cause our distress. Only when we stop playing the game by the rules of the ego can we find the door to a more authentic and resilient way of living. To apply the wisdom of dependent origination is to begin the work of reclaiming our own minds from the forces of habit and conditioning. It is a practical training in inner strength that allows us to stand unshakable in the face of life's inevitable challenges. When we understand that everything arises from conditions, we stop taking our suffering so personally. We realize that a difficult emotion or a stressful thought is not a permanent feature of who we are, but a temporary phenomenon that has appeared because the necessary conditions were present. This shift in perspective gives us the space to breathe and to choose a more skillful response. Instead of being swept away by a wave of anger at a colleague or a feeling of inadequacy in our personal relationships, we can pause and see the chain of causation as it unfolds. This pause is where our true power lies. It is the moment where we can decide not to feed the craving and not to strengthen the habit of clinging. Over time, this practice of clarity and mindfulness transforms our daily life into a laboratory of self-discovery. We begin to bring the same level of attention to our work, our conversations, and even our moments of solitude. We find that we are more present for others because we are no longer so preoccupied with defending our own egoic territory. We find that we are more effective in our work because we can see situations clearly without the distortion of personal bias and fear. This is the ultimate freedom that the Buddha spoke of, a freedom that is not dependent on changing the world around us, but on changing the way we relate to it. We no longer require the world to be a certain way for us to be at peace. We have found a source of stability within ourselves that is not built on the shifting sands of external circumstances. This inner resilience is not a cold or detached state, but one of deep compassion and warmth. As we see how our own suffering is caused by ignorance and craving, we begin to see the same process happening in everyone else. Our judgment of others is replaced by an understanding of the common struggle we all face as biological beings with complex minds. We see that everyone is just trying to find happiness in their own confused way, and this recognition naturally leads to a more kind and patient way of interacting with the world. The door of the mind is not opened by force or by intellectual willpower, but by the gentle and persistent light of awareness. It is opened every time we choose to see things as they really are rather than as we want them to be. By walking through this door, we leave behind the narrow prison of the self and step into a reality that is vast, interconnected, and profoundly peaceful. This is the invitation of the Buddha's teachings, a path that leads away from the exhaustion of the struggle and toward the quiet joy of a clear and open heart. As you move back into the rhythms of your day, take with you the simple practice of observing the links in the chain. Notice the moments of contact, the rise of feeling, and the subtle tug of craving. You do not need to do anything spectacular to begin this journey. You only need to maintain a quiet and honest presence with your own experience. Remember that the waves of the ocean will always rise and fall, but you have the capacity to understand the wind and the depths. May you find the strength to see clearly, the courage to let go of what is false, and the peace of a mind that is truly awake. This is the gift of awareness that remains with you always. In the quiet moments of our lives, we often find ourselves caught in an invisible web of comparison. When we look at our peers, we are not merely seeing other human beings, but mirrors that reflect our own perceived inadequacies or fleeting triumphs. This constant measurement of the self against the other is a source of profound exhaustion, yet it feels as natural as breathing. To navigate this complex landscape without losing our sense of peace, we must adopt a new perspective. By integrating the ancient insights of the Buddha on dependent origination with the modern understanding of our biological drives, we can begin to see the mechanical nature of our suffering. We are here to dismantle the illusions that bind us to competitive anxiety, allowing us to meet others with a heart that is both clear and unburdened. The anxiety we feel when we encounter a successful peer is not a personal failure of character, but rather the echoing voice of an ancient biological heritage. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived in small tribal groups where their social standing was directly tied to their chances of survival. To be at the bottom of the hierarchy meant less access to resources, less protection from predators, and a higher likelihood of being cast out into the wilderness. Our brains are essentially wired to monitor our relative status with a vigilance that borders on the obsessive. This is the biological foundation of what the Buddha called ignorance, or the fundamental misunderstanding of how reality functions. We mistakenly believe that there is a solid, independent self that must be defended and elevated at all costs. This perceived self is not a permanent entity, but a process that arises from the chain of dependent origination. It begins with the initial spark of ignorance, which gives rise to mental formations and the urge to categorize the world into pleasant and unpleasant experiences. When we walk into a room and see someone we consider a peer, our evolution-conditioned mind immediately begins a subconscious scan. It notes their clothing, their posture, their speech, and their accomplishments. Within seconds, we have placed them on an internal map and adjusted our own sense of worth accordingly. This process happens so fast that we often only feel the after effect, a sudden tightening in the chest, a flash of envy, or a rush of pride. We are caught in a cycle of suffering that was designed to keep us alive in a cave, but which now keeps us miserable in a modern office or a digital social network. The Buddha taught that by seeing this chain of events clearly, we can begin to interrupt the mechanical reaction. We can recognize that our fear of falling behind is not a reflection of our true value, but a relic of a time when social exclusion meant death. This recognition is the first step toward inner resilience, as it allows us to observe the impulse without being enslaved by it. We realize that the self we are trying to protect is actually a collection of changing parts, and the peers we are competing against are likewise caught in the same biological trap. This shared struggle is the bridge toward a more compassionate way of existing in the world. Instead of viewing every interaction as a battle for dominance, we can see it as a shared encounter between two beings trying to find their way in a complex world. When we dive deeper into the mechanics of dependent origination, we find the specific link where our suffering takes its strongest hold. This is the moment of contact, followed by feeling. Contact occurs the instant we perceive a peer, and from that contact, a feeling of pleasure, pain, or neutrality arises. If we see a friend who has just achieved something we desire, a painful feeling often emerges, not because we wish them harm, but because their success highlights our perceived lack. In that moment, the mind moves from feeling to craving. We crave the status they have, or we crave to be free from the discomfort of our own inferiority. This craving then leads to attachment, where we cling to the idea that our happiness depends entirely on being equal to or better than those around us. This is the analysis of the ego in real time. The Buddha shows us that this attachment is like a hand grasping a hot coal. We are the ones being burned, yet we refuse to let go because we think the coal is a part of who we are. We must ask ourselves why we allow our peace of mind to be held hostage by the variables of another person's life. Their promotion, their relationship, or their physical appearance are all conditioned phenomena that have nothing to do with our fundamental nature. Every peer you meet is a unique convergence of thousands of causes and conditions, including their genetics, their upbringing, their luck, and their effort. When you compare your internal reality with their external highlight reel, you are engaging in a logical fallacy that can only result in frustration. This analytical approach allows us to break down the peer relationship into its constituent parts. We see that the peer is not a solid obstacle, but a shifting flow of experiences. And we are the same. There is no static winner and no static loser, only a continuous process of change. By understanding the 12 links of dependent origination, we see that birth leads to aging and death. And in the same way, the birth of a competitive thought leads to the aging and death of our tranquility. If we do not feed the craving, the attachment cannot take root, and the cycle of suffering is broken at the source. This is not about becoming cold or indifferent, but about becoming profoundly clear. It is about recognizing that your worth is not a pie that someone else can take a slice from. Your capacity for awareness and presence is infinite and entirely independent of how many followers, dollars, or accolades your neighbor possesses. When we stop measuring the ocean with a teaspoon, we finally see the vastness of the water itself. The modern world has created a sophisticated architecture designed to exploit the very chains of dependent origination that the Buddha sought to break. We live in a culture that treats the human ego as a commodity to be harvested, and social media serves as the primary tool for this extraction. By presenting us with a constant stream of curated highlights from the lives of our peers, These platforms trigger our deep-seated evolutionary fears of being left behind or losing status. We must recognize that this is a collective delusion that we have all agreed to participate in. This system thrives on the gap between who we are and who we think we should be, and it keeps us in a state of perpetual hunger. We are told that if we just work a little harder, look a little better, or acquire a few more symbols of success, we will finally reach a plateau of safety where we no longer need to compare ourselves to others. But this plateau is a mirage. Dependent origination teaches us that as long as the causes of craving and ignorance remain, the result will always be suffering. Even those at the very top of the social or economic ladder are often the most haunted by the fear of falling. Their success has only raised the stakes of their competition. When we critique this structure, we are not merely complaining about modern technology, but observing how it intensifies the ancient habit of self-grasping. We have built a world that mirrors our inner turmoil, where the worth of a human being is measured by their utility or their visibility. This creates a profound sense of isolation, as even our friends and colleagues begin to feel like rivals. We must have the courage to see through this charade and realize that the game of comparison is rigged from the start. There is no winning in a race where the finish line is constantly being moved by the next advertising campaign or the next viral trend. By stepping back and witnessing this process, we can begin to reclaim our internal sovereignty. We can look at the digital noise and the societal pressures with a sense of calm detachment, recognizing them for what they are, temporary ripples on the surface of awareness. This critique is the necessary medicine that clears our vision, allowing us to stop seeking validation in a house of mirrors that is designed to keep us lost. Instead of trying to fix the reflection, we must look at the one who is looking, and realize that the light of consciousness was never lacking in the first place. Every advertisement and every status update is an invitation to forget our true nature and return to the cycle of craving. To resist this is not an act of willpower, but an act of seeing. When we see the strings of the puppet, we are no longer moved by them, and we can finally walk away from the performance. To truly meet our peers from a place of wisdom, we must cultivate a mind that is no longer divided by the labels of self and other. This does not mean losing our individuality or our drive, but rather grounding them in a deeper reality that is not threatened by the presence of another. When we apply the clarity we have gained through the analysis of dependent origination, our entire social dynamic shifts. We begin to see our peers not as benchmarks to surpass, but as fellow travelers who are subject to the same laws of nature as we are. Their successes become reasons for celebration rather than causes for envy, because we understand that all joy in the world is rare and precious. This practice of sympathetic joy is the ultimate antidote to the evolutionary drive for dominance. It is the realization that another person's light does not diminish your own. Rather, it increases the total amount of light in the world. This level of awareness creates an unshakable inner strength because it is not based on external circumstances that are beyond our control. It is based on the quiet freedom that comes from knowing that your peace of mind is your own responsibility. When you are no longer trying to prove anything to anyone, you become a magnetic presence. People feel safe around you because they are not being judged or measured. You move through your workplace, your family, and your social circles with a graceful transparency. You can work hard and pursue excellence without the frantic desperation that usually accompanies it. Your efforts are no longer fueled by the fear of being nothing, but by the joy of creative expression and the desire to be of benefit to others. This is the practical application of seeing the true nature of reality. It is the transition from a life of reaction to a life of conscious action. You will still feel the old impulses of the ego. The biological tug of comparison will still arise from time to time, but it will no longer have the power to knock you off your center. You will see the impulse as a passing cloud and return to the steady blue sky of your own presence. This is how we build a resilient mind. Not by building walls against the world, but by dismantling the internal barriers that keep us separate and defensive. In the end, meeting your peers is simply meeting yourself in another form. And when you find peace with yourself, you find peace with all beings. And this peace is the only gift that truly matters in a world of constant change. We leave this exploration not with a set of new rules, but with a new way of seeing. The teachings of the Buddha and the insights of evolutionary psychology both point toward the same truth. Our suffering is a process, not a permanent state. By understanding the roots of our comparison and the mechanics of our attachment, we step into a space of profound clarity. May you carry this awareness into your next conversation, your next meeting, and your next look in the mirror. You are not the labels the world gives you, and you are not the score the ego keeps. You are the vast, silent witness to it all. We often feel like we are drifting through a life that we cannot quite grasp, searching for a solid ground that seems to shift every time we take a step. This sense of unease is not a flaw in your character, but a fundamental misunderstanding of how reality functions. The Buddha spoke of a deep web of causality, a process where nothing exists in isolation and everything arises because of something else. This is the teaching of dependent origination, a map that reveals why we suffer and how we can stop the cycle of endless wanting. To see this clearly is to begin the journey of internal freedom. It requires us to look past our immediate desires and see the mechanics of the mind. Only then can we find a peace that does not depend on external circumstances. Consider the way a single seed contains the potential for a massive tree, yet that seed cannot become the tree without soil, water, and light. Our lives are exactly like this. We often imagine ourselves as separate entities, islands of consciousness floating through an indifferent universe. But this is a grand illusion created by our evolutionary heritage. Millions of years ago, our ancestors survived because their brains were fine-tuned to detect threats and seek rewards, creating a strong sense of a self that must be protected at all costs. This self is not a permanent soul, but a collection of biological and psychological processes that have been conditioned over eons. The Buddha identified this as the root of our confusion. He saw that our existence is built upon a chain of 12 interconnected links, a sequence where each step depends on the one before it. It begins with ignorance, not a lack of intellectual knowledge, but a failure to see things as they truly are. We ignore the fact that everything is in a constant state of flux. We ignore that our feelings are transient signals. Instead, we take our perceptions to be the ultimate truth. This ignorance fuels our mental formations, those deep-seated patterns and biases that dictate how we react to the world. These patterns are like riverbeds carved into the earth over many centuries. When the rain of experience falls, the water naturally flows down these pre-existing paths, often leading us back into the same cycles of anger, anxiety, or greed. From these formations, our consciousness arises, and with it comes the division of the world into subject and object, the me and the not me. This is the birth of the ego, a phantom that we spend our entire lives trying to satisfy. But if we look closely at the architecture of our mind, we see that there is no central commander in charge. There is only a series of events happening in rapid succession, much like the frames of a movie creating the illusion of smooth motion. When we understand this causality, the weight of the ego begins to lighten. We are no longer victims of a fixed destiny, but participants in a fluid process that can be changed through awareness. This realization is the beginning of true understanding. It allows us to step back from the frantic pace of modern life and ask ourselves what is truly driving our actions. Are we moving toward clarity, or are we merely following the old grooves of our biological programming? The Buddha did not ask us to believe him on faith, but to observe the rise and fall of our own experiences. To see the root of our being is to recognize that nothing arises without a cause, and by changing the cause, we can change the outcome. This is the science of the soul, a path toward unbinding the knots that keep us tied to dissatisfaction. Imagine you are walking through a crowded city street, and your senses are being bombarded by 1,000 different inputs. The colors of the advertisements, the sound of a distant siren, the smell of food from a nearby cafe. Each of these moments represents contact, the meeting of our sense organs with the external world. In the framework of dependent origination, this contact is the spark that ignites the entire psychological engine. From contact, feeling arises instantly. This is not a complex emotion, but a simple hedonic tone, a judgment that something is pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Our biology has evolved this system as a navigation tool. Pleasant things usually meant survival, like calorie-dense food or social warmth, while unpleasant things meant danger. However, in our modern world, this system has become hijacked by a culture designed to keep us in a state of perpetual wanting. When a pleasant feeling arises, it is followed almost immediately by craving. We want to hold on to the pleasure, to repeat it, and to intensify it. Conversely, when we encounter an unpleasant feeling, we crave its absence. We push it away with a frantic energy that only creates more tension. This transition from feeling to craving is the most critical junction in our inner life. It is where we lose our balance and fall into the trap of attachment. We start to believe that our happiness depends on acquiring the things we crave and avoiding the things we dislike. We become like a person trying to catch the wind in a net. Because the objects of our craving are by nature impermanent. The delicious meal is gone in 20 minutes. The thrill of a new purchase fades in a week, and the praise of others can turn into criticism in a single breath. When we cling to these passing shadows, we set ourselves up for inevitable grief. The Buddha observed that our clinging is what gives birth to our suffering. It creates a sense of becoming, where we are always trying to be someone else, to be somewhere else, or to have something else. We are never truly present because our minds are always reaching into the future or grasping at the past. This constant reaching is exhausting. It is the reason why we feel burned out and spiritually hollow even when we have achieved our goals. If we can learn to see the gap between feeling and craving, we find a space of immense power. We can acknowledge the pleasant feeling without needing to own it. We can acknowledge the painful feeling without needing to flee from it. In this space, we are no longer slaves to our biological impulses. We begin to see that the world is a flow of causes and effects, and we do not have to be swept away by the current. To analyze our experience this way is to deconstruct the machinery of the ego, revealing that the self we defend so fiercely is actually a collection of habits that we have the power to change. We must critique the very foundation of how we measure success and identity in a world that is obsessed with the individual. Our modern culture is built on the premise that we can achieve lasting satisfaction by rearranging the external world to fit our desires. This is a fundamental error in logic that leads to a collective madness. Evolutionary psychology tells us that we were never designed to be happy. We were designed to survive and reproduce. Nature does not care about our inner peace. It only cares that we keep seeking, keep competing, and keep consuming. This is why the high from a promotion or a new relationship lasts only a short time before the baseline of dissatisfaction returns. We are running on a treadmill that we ourselves are powering. The ego thrives on this movement because it creates the feeling of being someone important. We compare ourselves to others, building a house of cards made of social status, physical appearance, and material wealth. But if we look through the lens of dependent origination, we see that this self is entirely conditional. It depends on the opinions of people we do not even like. It depends on economic systems that are beyond our control. It is a fragile construction that requires constant maintenance and causes immense anxiety. When we critique this way of living, we are not being cynical. We are being realistic. We are acknowledging that trying to find stability in the unstable is a recipe for despair. This is where the wisdom of the Buddha becomes a radical act of rebellion against our own biological conditioning. It asks us to stop looking for the answer in more and start looking at the why. Why do I feel this urge to prove myself? Why do I feel a sense of lack when I see someone else succeed? By tracing these feelings back to their causes, we see they are just old echoes of a survival instinct that is no longer serving us. We can choose to stop feeding the flame. To break the cycle, we must develop a new perspective that does not center on the ego. This is not about losing our identity, but about expanding it to include the entire web of life. When we realize that our well-being is inextricably linked to the well-being of others, the narrow walls of the self begin to crumble. We no longer see the world as a series of obstacles or rewards, but as a profound interplay of energy and intention. This shift is the most difficult work a human being can do because it goes against millions of years of evolution. Yet it is the only work that leads to a peace that is truly unshakable. We must have the courage to question our own motivations and the honesty to see where we are still clinging to illusions of control. Integrating this profound understanding into our daily lives is not a task for the weak or the distracted. It requires a quiet and persistent strength that we must cultivate through every interaction and every breath. Applied awareness means that we do not just understand dependent origination as a philosophical concept, but we see it in action as we drink a cup of tea or navigate a difficult conversation at work. When we are criticized, instead of reacting with defensiveness, we observe the physical sensation of the sting, the rising heat in the chest, and the rapid thoughts that try to protect the image of the self. We see the link between contact and feeling, and we choose not to let it turn into the craving for validation. This is the practice of equanimity, an inner balance that remains steady whether the world offers praise or blame. It is a resilience that is not built on a hard shell, but on a deep flexibility and openness to the truth of the moment. In our relationships, seeing reality means recognizing that the people around us are also caught in their own chains of causality. They are acting out of their own conditioning, their own fears, and their own deep-seated habits. This realization naturally gives birth to a compassion that is far more powerful than simple pity. We no longer take their actions personally because we see the impersonal nature of the forces moving them. This clarity allows us to respond with kindness and wisdom rather than being pulled into their turbulence. In our work, We focus on the effort and the process rather than being obsessed with the outcome. We understand that while we can influence the causes, the ultimate result is dependent on a vast array of factors beyond our reach. This releases us from the paralyzing fear of failure and the arrogance of success. We become more effective because our energy is no longer being drained by the friction of the ego. We move through the world with a light touch, engaging fully and deeply with life without needing to possess it. This is the true nature of a liberated mind. It is a mind that has seen the gears of the machine and is no longer caught in the wheels. We realize that the ending of suffering is not a destination we reach in the future, but a quality of presence we bring to the now. Every moment is an opportunity to break a link in the chain, to choose awareness over habit, and to find the stillness that exists at the center of the storm. As we walk this path, we discover that the freedom we were seeking was never something to be acquired, but something that was already there, hidden beneath the layers of our own clinging. The wisdom of the Buddha is a call to awaken from the dream of a separate self. It is an invitation to see the beautiful and complex dance of dependency that connects all things. When we stop fighting against the flow of reality, we find a strength that is both gentle and invincible. You are not an isolated spark in a dark void, but a part of a vast and luminous process that has no beginning and no end. Take this understanding with you as you move through your day. Let it be the quiet light that guides your steps and the soft ground that supports your weight. In the silence of your own awareness, you will find the truth that sets you free. Have you ever wondered why life often feels like a series of disjointed events that leave you feeling overwhelmed and out of control? We struggle to find a solid center in a world that is constantly shifting beneath our feet. The Buddha realized that our suffering does not come from the world itself, but from our failure to see how everything is connected. He pointed to a single profound truth called dependent origination to explain the mechanics of our existence. This teaching suggests that nothing arises on its own and everything depends on a web of hidden causes and conditions. It is the ultimate map of the human mind. By understanding this law, we can stop fighting against the current of reality and start living with a new perspective that transforms every relationship and every thought. Let us look deeper into this wisdom. The Buddha spent 45 years teaching because he found a way to stop the wheel of suffering by understanding its mechanics. He did not ask his followers to believe in a creator or a grand design, but rather to look at the simple fact that when this is present, that comes to be. This is the fundamental law of causality that governs every aspect of our lives, from the growth of a forest to the rising of an angry thought in the mind. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a pond and you throw a stone into the water. The ripples that spread outward are not separate from the stone or the water or the force of your arm. They are a manifestation of all those things coming together in a specific way at a specific moment. If you change the weight of the stone or the stillness of the water, the ripples will be different. This is how the Buddha viewed human existence. He saw that our suffering is not a random punishment or a permanent state of being, but a result of specific conditions. He described a chain of 12 links that bind us to the cycle of dissatisfaction. It begins with a lack of awareness, an ignorance of how things truly work. Because we do not see the interconnected nature of reality, we begin to create mental patterns and habits. These patterns give rise to a consciousness that feels separate from everything else. This consciousness then seeks a physical form and a mind to inhabit, which leads to the development of our 6 senses. These senses are like windows that allow us to touch the world. but they also create the ground for contact. When we make contact with an object, a feeling arises. That feeling might be pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. It is at this point that our biological programming takes over. We crave the pleasant and we push away the unpleasant. This craving turns into clinging, a desperate attempt to hold on to what is fleeting or to avoid what is inevitable. This clinging solidifies into a sense of becoming, a belief that we are a fixed self that must be protected and satisfied at all costs. This belief leads to birth, which in the Buddhist sense refers to the birth of a new identity or a new desire. And wherever there is birth, there must be aging, decay, and eventually death. By laying out this chain, the Buddha showed that if we can break even one link, particularly the link between feeling and craving, the entire structure of suffering begins to collapse. This is not a mystical process, but a logical one. It requires us to move away from the idea that things happen by chance and to start seeing the intricate web of dependencies. When we realize that our current state of mind is the result of thousands of previous choices and conditions, we stop being victims of fate and start becoming masters of our own path. This clarity allows us to meet life with a sense of calm strength, knowing that while we cannot control every condition, we can influence the ones that matter most. We begin to see that there is no solid person at the center of the storm, only a series of processes that we can learn to navigate with grace. To understand why this ancient wisdom is so difficult to practice, we must look at the way our brains have evolved over millions of years. Our biology is not concerned with spiritual liberation or seeing the ultimate truth of reality. Its only goal is survival and reproduction. From an evolutionary standpoint, it was highly beneficial for our ancestors to see the world as a collection of separate and permanent things. If a tiger is lunging at you, you do not want to contemplate the fact that the tiger is a collection of changing atoms and dependent conditions. You want to see a solid, dangerous object that you must escape immediately. Our brains develop to create shortcuts, mental models that simplify the overwhelming complexity of the world into manageable chunks. One of the most powerful shortcuts is the creation of the self. By building a narrative of a permanent identity who is the hero of the story, the brain can better navigate social hierarchies and protect the physical body. This sense of self is a brilliant adaptation that allowed our species to thrive in harsh environments. However, what was once a survival advantage has become a source of modern misery. Because we are hardwired to seek permanence in an impermanent world, we are constantly at odds with the true nature of existence. We want our relationships to stay the same, our bodies to remain youthful, and our successes to last forever. When the law of dependent origination asserts itself and things begin to change, we experience this as a personal tragedy rather than a natural process. We are like people trying to hold back the tide with a plastic bucket. It is an exhausting and impossible task. This mismatch between our biological instincts and reality is what the Buddha called suffering. Modern psychology has begun to recognize this through the study of the default mode network in the brain, which is active when we are lost in thoughts about ourselves and the past. This network is constantly weaving a story that makes us the center of the universe. It reinforces the illusion that we are separate from the world around us. When we look through the lens of dependent origination, we begin to see that this story is just a series of mental events conditioned by our biology and our environment. We are not the authors of our thoughts so much as the place where thoughts happen. By recognizing that our sense of self is a constructed process rather than a solid entity, we can begin to relax our grip on life. We can see that our anxieties and fears are also dependent on conditions. They are not who we are. They are just ripples in the pond. This perspective does not mean we stop caring or acting in the world. Instead, it allows us to act with more clarity and less reactivity. We no longer have to defend a fragile ego because we realize that the ego is just a temporary pattern of information. This shift in thinking is the first step toward a resilience that does not depend on everything going our way. It is a resilience born from understanding that we are part of a larger, unfolding process that is far more vast and beautiful than the narrow story of the self. If we look closely at our modern landscape, we see that almost every structure of our society is designed to reinforce the very ignorance the Buddha warned against. We are constantly told that we are independent agents who can and should control every outcome of our lives. This myth of the self-made person is a direct contradiction to the law of dependent origination. It ignores the thousands of conditions, from the education we received to the air we breathe and the infrastructure that supports us, that make our current existence possible. When we buy into this illusion of total independence, we become prone to deep feelings of shame when we fail and arrogant pride when we succeed. We fail to see that our successes were supported by a hidden ocean of causes, and our failures were often the result of conditions outside our immediate control. This cultural obsession with the individual creates a profound sense of isolation and competition. We see others not as parts of the same interconnected web, but as obstacles to our own progress or as tools for our own satisfaction. This is the root of much of our social and environmental friction. If we do not recognize that the health of the forest depends on the health of the soil, we will eventually destroy the very thing that sustains us. The same is true for our mental health. If we treat our anxiety or our depression as a personal flaw rather than a conditioned response to a complex environment, we trap ourselves in a cycle of self-blame. We must critique the idea that we can achieve happiness by simply rearranging the external furniture of our lives. No amount of wealth, status, or physical beauty can provide lasting security because all of those things are themselves subject to the laws of change and dependency. They are not solid ground. They are shifting sands. When we rely on these fleeting conditions for our sense of worth, we are building a house on a foundation of clouds. The Buddha calls us to a radical form of responsibility. Not the responsibility of a burdened ego, but the responsibility of a conscious participant in a vast system. This means acknowledging that every action we take and every word we speak becomes a condition for the future. We are not passive observers of life, but active weavers of the web. However, we must be careful not to fall into the trap of nihilism. Seeing that the self is empty of a permanent core does not mean that nothing matters. On the contrary, it means that everything matters because everything is connected. A single act of kindness can ripple out in ways we can never fully predict. By critiquing our own tendency to cling to a rigid identity, we open up a space for a more fluid and compassionate way of being. We stop trying to be the master of the universe and start learning how to dance with it. This requires us to look directly into the source of our discomfort and ask what conditions are making this feeling possible right now. It is a movement away from judgment and toward investigation. It is a movement away from the isolated I and toward the interconnected whole. Applying the wisdom of dependent origination in our daily lives leads to the development of a mind that is truly unshakable. This is not a mind that is cold or indifferent, but one that is so deeply grounded in reality that it cannot be easily tossed about by the changing winds of fortune. When we encounter a difficult person or a frustrating situation, our first instinct is usually to react with anger or defensiveness. However, if we pause and apply the lens of causality, our perspective shifts. We begin to see that the person who is acting out is also a product of their own conditions, their upbringing, their stresses, their fears, and their own biological predispositions. This realization does not necessarily excuse their behavior, but it removes the personal sting. We see a complex chain of events rather than a deliberate attack on our character. This is the birth of true compassion. A compassion that is based on understanding rather than just sentiment. As we deepen our practice, we also begin to see the conditions that lead to our own inner turmoil. We notice how a lack of sleep, a certain type of food, or a specific social media habit can condition a state of anxiety. Instead of identifying with the anxiety and saying, "I am anxious," we observe and say there is anxiety arising due to these specific factors. This small shift in language reflects a massive shift in consciousness. We become like a scientist observing a laboratory rather than a person drowning in a sea of emotion. This clarity gives us the power to change the conditions we can control and to accept the ones we cannot with a quiet heart. We find that we no longer need to chase after happiness as if it were a prize to be won. Instead, we focus on cultivating the conditions that allow peace to arise naturally. Peace is not something you get. It is something that happens when the conditions for conflict are removed. This is the ultimate freedom that the Buddha promised. It is a freedom from the tyranny of the ego and its endless demands. When we stop trying to force the world to be a certain way and start understanding why it is the way it is, we experience a profound sense of relief. We are finally in harmony with the law of existence. Our relationships become more stable because we stop expecting others to provide us with a permanent sense of security that they do not possess. Our work becomes more focused because we are no longer distracted by the need for constant validation. We live with a sense of lightweight agility, moving through the world with purpose but without the heavy baggage of self-importance. We understand that we are a process, a beautiful and intricate flow of energy and information that is part of a much larger story. This is the true nature of reality that the Buddha wanted us to see. It is a reality that is far more vibrant and interconnected than anything our small egos could ever imagine. By resting in this awareness, we find a strength that is not brittle but flexible. A strength that can endure any storm because it knows that even the storm is dependent on conditions and will eventually pass. The teaching of dependent origination is not a philosophy to be studied from a distance, but a reality to be lived every moment. It is an invitation to step out of the narrow confines of the self and into the vastness of the interconnected world. As you go about your day, try to notice the invisible threads that connect you to everything and everyone around you. Notice how your thoughts arise and fade away based on the conditions of your environment. In this simple observation, you will find the seeds of a profound liberation. You are not an island. You are the entire ocean in a single drop. May you walk with clarity and find peace in the flow of life. We live in an age of unprecedented connectivity, yet many of us feel more isolated than ever before. This paradox stems from a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be connected. We look at our screens and see a world of fragmented information, but we fail to see the invisible threads that bind our inner lives to the external reality we inhabit. The teachings of the Buddha offer a profound map of this territory through the principle of dependent origination. This is not just an ancient doctrine, but a psychological and evolutionary framework that explains why we suffer and how we can find genuine peace. By examining how things come to be, we can learn to navigate our modern challenges with a mind that is both calm and clear. We invite you to look directly at the nature of existence and recognize the power of connection as a tool for total transformation. The root of human suffering often lies in the persistent illusion of a solitary self that exists independently of the surrounding environment, a belief that we are separate observers watching a world that happens to us. This perspective is deeply embedded in our biological heritage, as our ancestors survived by distinguishing clearly between the self and the other, the predator and the prey. However, the Buddha invited us to look closer at the fabric of reality through the lens of dependent origination, showing that every phenomenon arises in reliance upon conditions. Nothing in the known universe possesses an inherent, unchanging essence because everything is part of a vast, shimmering web of causality. When we look at a single leaf, we must also see the rain, the sun, the soil, and the history of the earth that made its existence possible. To see the leaf is to see the non-leaf elements that sustain it. This is not a poetic metaphor, but a rigorous description of physical and psychological reality. Our modern minds struggle with this because our evolutionary programming prioritizes survival over truth. The brain is a prediction machine designed to categorize and isolate objects to ensure safety and resource acquisition. It carves the world into pieces so it can navigate them. Yet, in doing so, it creates a sense of alienation and loneliness that haunts our daily lives. We feel alone because we have forgotten how to perceive the threads that bind us to every breath of wind and every pulse of life. By understanding that we are a process rather than a static thing, we begin to relax the grip of fear. If there is no permanent self to defend, the walls of our inner fortress can finally crumble, revealing a profound sense of belonging to the whole. This realization is the cornerstone of interdependence, which serves as the foundation for a resilient and compassionate mind. When we recognize that our happiness is tied to the well-being of others and the health of our environment, our actions become more precise and ethical. We no longer act out of a narrow sense of greed, but out of a clear understanding of what sustains us. This shift in perception requires a radical honesty with ourselves, as it challenges the very core of our egoic identity. We must be willing to see that our thoughts, emotions, and physical sensations are also conditioned by factors outside our immediate control. They are like ripples on a pond caused by a falling stone, temporary and situational. By tracing these ripples back to their source, we find not a solid center, but a dance of conditions that are constantly shifting and transforming. This is the path to freedom, the path of seeing things as they truly are. It is a journey from the isolation of the ego to the liberation of connection. Through this understanding, we find a strength that is not based on aggression or control, but on the unshakable realization that we have never been truly alone. We are the universe experiencing itself through a specific set of conditions, and in that realization, the fear of life begins to dissolve. To analyze the mechanism of suffering, we must observe how our minds react to the world in real time. The Buddha described a chain of 12 links that explain the cycle of birth and death. But for our modern lives, we can focus on the crucial junction between feeling and craving. Evolutionary psychology tells us that our brains evolved to seek pleasure and avoid pain as a way to ensure our genes would persist into the next generation. When we encounter something pleasant, a neurological signal of reward is triggered. and our mind immediately moves toward it. When we encounter something unpleasant, we recoil in an attempt to protect ourselves. This is the biological substrate of attachment, a constant state of reaching and pushing that keeps our minds in a state of agitation. We become slaves to these impulses, believing that if we can just acquire enough of the things we like and eliminate everything we dislike, we will finally be happy. But dependent origination teaches us that because the conditions for pleasure are always changing, any happiness based on these conditions is inherently fragile and temporary. When the conditions shift, the pleasure vanishes and we are left with a sense of loss and frustration. This cycle repeats itself thousands of times a day in the small movements of our attention. We check our phones for a hit of dopamine. We seek validation from others to soothe our insecurity, and we avoid difficult conversations because they feel like a threat to our peace. By understanding the chain of causation, we can insert a moment of awareness between the feeling and the reaction. This is where true choice resides. Instead of being a passive victim of our evolutionary drives, we can learn to observe the feeling as a neutral phenomenon without being swept away by the craving that follows. We begin to see that the urge to possess or escape is just another condition arising in the mind, not a command that we must obey. This clarity allows us to stay centered in the midst of chaos, knowing that all feelings are like clouds passing through a wide and open sky. We are no longer defined by what we want or what we fear, but by the quality of our presence in each moment. This analysis is not meant to make us cold or indifferent, but to give us the space to respond with wisdom rather than instinct. It is a process of deconstructing the habits of the ego until we find the stillness that lies beneath the noise of desire. When we see the mechanics of our own minds, we gain a profound compassion for others who are also caught in this same cycle of craving and dissatisfaction. We recognize that their anger or greed is not a personal attack, but the result of their own conditioned reactions. This understanding breaks the cycle of conflict and opens the door to a more skillful way of living in the world. By mastering the analysis of our inner landscape, we reclaim the power of our own attention and learn to live with a sense of purpose that is grounded in reality rather than illusion. When we examine the modern landscape of self-improvement, we often find a hidden agenda that seeks to strengthen the very ego that causes our distress. The contemporary narrative of success is built on the idea of a hero overcoming the world, a solitary figure who achieves greatness through sheer force of will. This story is appealing because it fits perfectly with our biological drive for status and dominance, but it is fundamentally at odds with the truth of our interdependence. We are told to build our personal brand, to curate our image, and to protect our boundaries as if we were islands in a hostile sea. However, this fixation on the individual self only deepens our anxiety because it requires us to defend a construction that is inherently unstable and subject to the whims of change. We spend our lives trying to polish a reflection in a moving stream, never realizing that the reflection cannot be held or perfected. Evolutionary psychology suggests that this constant social comparison was once vital for survival within a tribe. But in a globalized society, it has become a source of chronic stress and inadequacy. We are trapped in a cycle of wanting to be special while fearing we are nothing. The critique offered by the Buddha suggests that the problem is not that we have failed to achieve enough, but that we are operating from a false map of reality. We treat our relationships as transactions and our environment as a resource to be exploited, failing to see that any harm we do to the web of life eventually vibrates back to us. This is the shadow of our technological progress. We have mastered the outer world while becoming increasingly lost in the inner one. We have more information than any generation in history, yet we lack the wisdom to know what is enough. To break free from this, we must embrace the radical honesty of uncertainty, accepting that we cannot control the myriad conditions that shape our lives. This acceptance is not a form of defeatism, but a profound realignment with the way things actually are. When we stop fighting against the flow of causality, we stop wasting our energy on impossible tasks like maintaining a perfect and permanent self-image. We can then redirect that energy toward genuine connection and meaningful action. The critique of the ego is not an invitation to self-loathing, but an invitation to a larger and more expansive way of being. It is a movement from a life of frantic accumulation to a life of graceful participation. We begin to see that our individual story is just a small thread in a magnificent and complex tapestry. By letting go of the need to be the center of the universe, we finally find our place within it. This shift requires us to look past the superficial distractions of modern life and confront the raw reality of our existence with courage and clarity. Only then can we move beyond the illusions of the ego and discover a peace that does not depend on external validation or the temporary fulfillment of our desires. The application of these insights into our daily existence transforms every action into a practice of mindfulness and presence. When we bring the understanding of dependent origination into our work, we stop seeing our tasks as mere burdens or means to an end. We recognize that our labor is supported by the efforts of countless others, from the people who built the infrastructure we use to the colleagues who share our goals. This realization naturally fosters a sense of gratitude and responsibility. In our relationships, seeing the conditioned nature of the other person allows us to meet them with a heart that is open rather than judgmental. We understand that their struggles and their flaws are the result of a complex history of causes and conditions, just like our own. This does not mean we tolerate harm, but it means we respond with a clarity that seeks to heal rather than to punish. We become less reactive and more responsive, creating a space where genuine understanding can flourish. This is the cultivation of equanimity, a mind that remains steady whether it encounters praise or blame, success or failure. This inner stability is not a state of emotional numbness, but a deep and vibrant engagement with the world that is not shaken by the changing winds of fortune. It is a strength that comes from knowing that all things are temporary and that our true nature is not found in the outcomes of our efforts, but in the quality of our awareness. As we move through our day, we can practice this awareness by simply noticing the connections that sustain us. The food we eat, the water we drink, and the air we breathe are all reminders of our intimate bond with the planet. We are not separate from nature. We are a specific expression of it. This perspective changes how we consume and how we care for the world around us. We realize that protecting the environment is not a charity, but an act of self-preservation and love. The wisdom of the Buddha is not something to be studied in books and then forgotten. It is something to be lived in every breath and every step. It is a path of continuous learning and unlearning, where we slowly shed the layers of ignorance that have clouded our vision for so long. We learn to trust the process of life, even when it takes us into difficult and uncertain terrain. By staying rooted in the present moment and seeing the web of causality in action, we develop a profound resilience that can weather any storm. We find that the more we give of ourselves to this understanding, the more we receive in the form of peace and clarity. This is the ultimate power of connection, a way of being that is both humble and majestic, allowing us to walk through the world with a light heart and an unwavering spirit. As we reach the end of this exploration, let the silence speak to what remains when the words have faded away. The path of understanding dependent origination is not a destination, but a way of walking through life with eyes wide open and a heart that is no longer afraid of the dark. You have the capacity to see the truth for yourself, to feel the pulse of the universe in your own veins, and to recognize your place in the grand design of existence. May this wisdom be a lantern in your hand as you navigate the complexities of your own journey. Remember that every moment is an opportunity to begin again, to reconnect, and to awaken to the vastness of who you truly are. Peace is not found by escaping the world, but by embracing it with wisdom and love.